All righty, we are back. So yeah, the next talk is kind of the final piece of this journey, this software engineering sort of journey that starts, with, I mean, it really starts more with UI UX, which we did not have a talk about that today, but there's a boot camp about that right now tonight. But we dealt with serverless back-end engineering, universal apps for front end. We talked about serverless, pipeline deployment pipelines and how to essentially create really easy to manage pipelines for deploying serverless apps. And sort of the, one of the final pieces, at least in my head, for this is, the automated testing piece, because basically, if you're building apps that are going to be used by a large number of people, you don't really want to rely just on humans kind of banging around every time code changes, trying to figure out what broke and what didn't break, because most modern day apps just have too many buttons and moving parts to really truly have any confidence that things are not breaking by using manual testing. And so, over the years, obviously, there's been a lot of testing frameworks that have emerged, like Mocha, Jasmine, all these different frameworks, and most of these require just as much engineering effort and coding effort to maintain these code tests as is required to actually maintain the app itself. And so, every time you change up some features, either the engineer changing the features has to also go in and change the code tests, or some other group that's doing test automation will have to go in and change the code tests. And, and then there's all kinds of different code tests. I mean, there's unit tests that test on a really granular level. There's more end-to-end type tests that kind of like bang their app around as if it's a user. And so, and my philosophy over the years has sort of evolved to the point where I hate code tests. And I think, every app should have absolutely no code tests, really, truly. And that's kind of extreme. I mean, that is an extremist view. And a lot of people would argue against me, but I believe that if you do a really good job of end-to-end testing, which is just sort of, stressing the app as you're a user, logging in, doing this, doing that. Actually, like if you could just really use every single feature available in the app, then usually if you have a comprehensive end-to-end testing that will simulate user behavior, then if there's any bug introduced in the app, the end-to-end tests will actually find it. And so the question is, then how do you actually do the end-to-end test? And I think that the best way to do end-to-end test is with codeless testing, where you don't write any code whatsoever. Something maybe as easy as you could install a browser extension, and whenever you have your test environment up, you can just click record and you can start kind of surfing through there. And, you might break it up into little small use cases where you say, okay, I'm going to test the login. I'm going to test the log out. I'm going to test the create a product. I'm going to test delete the product or whatever. You can create each little scenario and group all those together into a test suite. And then from that point on, if you hook it into your CI pipeline, kind of like Frank was talking about a while ago, then every time you merge code and deploy it to, say, a test environment, you can do a webhook and you can, bam, you can trigger off your entire test suite, and it'll actually go through as if it was a user, and it'll test all these different scenarios. And if every single one of them passes and nothing broke, then and only then will you deploy your code to production because you're confident that nothing broke. And then, of course, if you go back and you change some code that actually breaks a test, unlike in the old days or even still the modern days where people have to go whacking around and changing these tests, with something like GhostInspector, which, Justin is the CEO of Ghost and CEO and founder of GhostInspector, you can simply go back into GhostInspector, basically go back right back into your browser and just re-record some of the behavior around a single little scenario in that big test suite. Literally click the play button, re-record it, and just that one little scenario, and then boom, everything is working again. And so this is something that a non-technical person could do. You could literally have test engineers that are doing hundreds, maybe even thousands of tests, on your app and don't have any engineering experience at all. And so I think the product is amazing. We use it extensively to test every single thing we have. We haven't used it for mobile, obviously, but we use it for all of our web apps. And I'm going to turn it over to Justin to show you GhostInspector.
Yeah, thanks, Leroy. That was an awesome introduction. Really happy to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and just try to add some more detail around all the things that Leroy just mentioned. I'm going to pop over to my slides here. So I'm going to talk about codeless testing with GhostInspector today, codeless automated testing. My name is Justin Clem. I'm the founder and CEO of GhostInspector. And what we do is automated testing for websites and apps. And specifically, we do browser testing, or sometimes called end-to-end or E2E testing. And what we're doing is actually opening up your website or your app in a browser, and we're carrying out interactions, things like clicking and assigning, just like a user would. And we're testing your website in a real world environment exactly as a user would encounter your website. So that's the type of testing we're going to talk about today. Just a quick kind of overview of what I'm going to cover in this talk. I want to give a little bit of foundational knowledge on end-to-end testing first. So we'll talk about what it is, why would you do it, what's the value in this kind of testing, and also how does it work. A little bit of knowledge under the hood of what's going on when you're actually automating a browser. Then we're going to jump over and we're going to create, run, and maintain an automated test with GhostInspector. We have a lot of really cool tools and features that Leroy alluded to, a test recorder, a codeless editor. We do screenshot comparison. We take videos. We try to add all these features and make them really accessible on our platform so that you can get up and running with browser testing straight away. And then I'll circle back and try to answer any questions that anybody might have, whether it's about GhostInspector or automated testing in general, or browser automation, or Selenium, or other packages that are out there. So a little more detail on what end-to-end testing is. As I mentioned, you're launching a browser and you're using automation to interact with a website or app through the UI the same way a user would. So you're automating the clicks and the assignments, the drag and drops, the file uploads, all those things that a user is actually doing. You're performing them through automation. And ideally, you're doing this in a browser in the cloud. So you're not there manually clicking through your browser and having to do this over and over again, or having this run on your desktop for 10 or 15 minutes and take up your time. The idea, I guess, the name end-to-end testing, I've heard two explanations for this idea of end-to-end testing, or testing your application from end to end. One is kind of like you're testing your website from one end of the website to the other end, right? So like you can do these pretty long flows, like you create an account and then you add an item to your shopping cart and then you check out. So pretty long sequences that might span a number of pages in your website. And then the other explanation for end-to-end that I've heard is that you're testing from the front end to the back end. So if you think about what happens when even just Leroy kind of alluded to this, when you just hit the login button to log into your app, you're clicking a button that's probably triggering some JavaScript, maybe in React. It's making a network request that's hitting your server, or maybe some serverless route. That's maybe hitting a database and fetching your data. And then all of that's coming back through all of those layers. So by testing your application in an actual browser, you're touching on all those layers. So from the front end to the back end, either definition really works. They both kind of work. And then what you're doing is testing both the functionality and the visuals of your website. So you can do screenshots and screenshot comparison, because you want to make sure that your website, your app is not only working the way you expect it to work, you want it to look the way you'd expect it to look. So you wouldn't want, buttons showing up in the wrong place or missing styles or images. And you can do that by testing in a browser. Why is end-to-end testing valuable? So you're mimicking the user's experience exactly. So it's not like an isolated, we'll talk a little bit about unit tests and integration tests and other types of coded tests, but you're really testing your finished product in its usable production form. So you're testing it the same way users are going to experience and hitting any of those bugs that they're going to experience. Like I mentioned, front end to back end, all those different layers and all those different parts of your application that are working together, you're able to test those as a whole. You're not just testing a front end JavaScript framework or some code on the back end. You're making sure that it all plays nicely together and you get the end result that you're expecting. And lastly, you have the ability to test the really complex interactions that are hard to mock up. So if you think about something like even just logging into your application or checking out, and actually putting a testing credit card into Stripe and placing an order, those are really complex interactions. And testing those with something like unit tests, is a good idea, but trying to cover everything, the whole flow, it's a lot of work and it's a lot of tests. So you can hit these scenarios and walk through these real world scenarios where in some cases, this is the only way to test it. One of the features we have is email testing. So you can do things like sign up for an account or send an invite link from your app Then you can receive that email and open it. And does the email render correctly? And can you click the invite link? So types of things that are only really testable in real world environments. Where does end-to-end testing fit into your testing approach? I'm gonna I guess Leroy mentioned maybe you just end-to-end test everything. I'm not going to tell you not to do that, but I'm going to add a little more balance here. On the right side, you've got a lot of times in the testing world, the traditional test pyramid. So down at the bottom there, you've got your unit tests, right? And unit tests are usually coded tests that are testing like a really atomic piece of code. So imagine like an addition function that takes numbers and adds them together. You might have a unit test that takes 1 and 2 and make sure that it adds them and returns 3, right? So these are really simple, isolated tests. The scope of what they test is limited, but you can see on the right side of the pyramid, we have this maintenance tax. And the idea is that these tests they're pretty cheap because you're not gonna have to modify them very much. They're often testing pieces of code that aren't gonna change. And so you're not in there having to maintain them. And that's good, because maintenance takes time. As we go up this test pyramid, you hit integration tests, and that's usually tying 2 or more pieces together. So you could imagine maybe like a controller touching some kind of like database class or something. And maybe you're like mocking up some of that data and it's just returning fake JSON. It's kind of tying a couple of pieces of code together. The scope of what it can test, expands out a little more, but that maintenance tax goes up because it's touching more things. At the top, traditionally, we have end-to-end tests, and that's the type of testing we're talking about. And it's accessing your app through the UI and touching everything. So it gives you a ton of power and a ton of coverage, but also probably the most maintenance tax because anything that changed in your application could affect these tests. Often the UI is the most variable part of your app. So you might be moving buttons around or changing them. So usually these tests kind of sit at the top. With GhostInspector, we've tried to make this a lot easier and deal with some of those maintenance problems and make this a lot more accessible so they can leverage these tests in a more like sustainable way. But I still recommend that folks start with maybe 10 or 20 core features of your website or app. So think about, the 10 things that have to work for your app to be functional. Can I log in? Can I update my profile? Can I add an item to my cart? Can I check out? Does a contact form work? Like, what are the most important things? Build tests around those. Get a feeling for what this testing is like and how to manage it. And then you can start to expand out and really test more and more. And you can potentially distort the proportions of this pyramid a little bit so that your end-to-end tests cover a lot of scope. How does end-to-end test work? So when I show you GhostInspector, a lot of this is pretty seamless, but I want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what's actually going on when you're doing browser automation. So what we're doing is performing automated interactions on elements, so in the DOM on the page. And we're doing that by using selectors to target them and perform those interactions. So I'm going to pop out of the slides here for a second, and we'll just talk through a little bit what this looks like on a page. So I've got Google open here. We'll open DevTools. And if you're front-end savvy, this is all going to be really basic review. But for those of you who are maybe new to front-end tech or haven't worked on the front end very much, when you've got a page like this, so everything on the page, on any page in your browser, is represented by the DOM underneath, right? And as I come around and highlight the elements, so for instance, this image, it's represented underneath in the code by an image tag. And it's got some alternate text, and it's got a source, and it's got dimensions. And the same, if I come down to this input box here, right? It's an input element. It's got a name Q for query, I guess is what Google uses. So every element on the page is represented underneath in the DOM. And when you're doing automation, what you're doing is creating selectors to target these elements and then performing the actions. Now we have a test recorder that basically records what you do and generates these selectors for you. But it's helpful to know how they work, and it can be really helpful to tweak your selectors and adjust them as your application is changing. If I come over here to the console and I want to query for an element, This $ is just kind of a shortcut query command in Chrome. I can start to target this with different syntaxes. So this is CSS, where I'm saying, give me the input element with the name Q. And if I do that query, it's going to find that input, right? If you've ever done CSS and you've styled a website, you're already familiar with how this syntax works. It's the same one that you use to style pages. It's just that we're using it to target elements for automation instead of for styling. So IDs, classes, all of those things you've seen before are all used here also for targeting. Another syntax you can use that's really similar, looks slightly different, is Xpath. Really similar kind of concept. Let's see, something like this. Similar concept, input with the name Q, syntax is a little bit different. Each of these two syntaxes have slightly different trade-offs and why you might use one or the other. Again, GhostInspector really tries to pick these for you, and in some cases will generate a couple of these so that you have fallbacks. But it's important to understand like what's actually happening and how that targeting is working. And most automation tools are going to use this approach. This is a pretty standard approach for targeting things on the page. Pop back to our slides here. So that outlines how we're actually going to target elements and what's actually happening under the hood in terms of identifying elements on the page. In terms of automation, there are a number of different APIs under the hood that can be used. Some of these you may have heard of. Selenium is one that's been around for a really long time, kind of like the original Selenium WebDriver. At some point, they kind of merged. It's available in almost all browsers. It's standardized, which is good, but also means that it's a little slow, not in terms of performance, like a little slow in terms of new features. Puppeteer is one that Chrome launched a couple of years ago to automate Chrome. Playwright, I think, is a spin-off of that automates a couple of browsers. Cypress is another one that's gotten popular. So again, with GhostInspector, this is happening behind the scenes, and it kind of saves you from having to learn the intricacies of these APIs. But these APIs are out there, and you can use them to automate local browsers or code your tests if that's your preference. Kind of the traditional approach to how this worked is you would typically pick a package like Selenium, and you'd pick a language like JavaScript, and you'd start coding your tests. So you'd write those selectors we just talked about, and you'd write your steps for like clicking and assigning, which is a fairly tedious task because it's a very human process to interact with an application. And why not just at least capture initially that through your own performance of those interactions. But you typically code these out. And then you'd have to figure out, where you're going to run these tests. You can run them locally, but then if you want to do it during deployment or you want to do it live on production, you might want to do it in the cloud. So then you're thinking about virtual machines, and are you building your own? Are you using a platform? Then you're integrating it into your CI configuration, which often meant like hitting various APIs or containers and things like that. There's a lot of flexibility, and this approach can still work well for you, but it's a very technical approach, and there's a lot of moving parts and pieces to glue together. And what I found when I was building GhostInspector initially, 6-7 years ago, I was a front-end developer, and I felt like this testing was really important to do, but anytime I pitched it to companies, it was really hard to tell them they'd need to have an engineer or two spend a couple of weeks, building all this stuff. Like nobody went for it because it was just too much work. So the idea with GhostInspector and codeless automation is that you can jump into this, and as you'll see when we demo that, within a couple of minutes you can have useful tests running and really lower that hurdle. So GhostInspector's approach, we're a hosted service. We have a tool like a recorder, a codeless editor, do screenshots, store those all for you. We have some plugins that make it pretty easy to integrate with your CI process or do post-deployment tests. And our goal is to really try to lower the technical hurdle and make this a lot more approachable. It's super powerful, it's super useful, but traditionally it's been really challenging to build these tests and maintain them. So that's the problem we're trying to solve. One last slide before I jump into the demo. I just want to make the point that End-to-end test is really powerful and growing. It adds a significant amount of test coverage really quickly, so there's a lot of value there. Something that's really nice about the Codeless approach is that you can really empower your whole team to do this type of testing. So it's not just like the test engineer who knows Selenium who's able to build these anymore. You can have anybody at your company jump in and help with these or test portions of the website that they're familiar with, which is really helpful for smaller companies. And then for students, because I know there are lots of students at this event, this type of QA automation, quality assurance automation and test automation is really a growing field. So like understanding what's going on and how some of this works can be really useful and open up a lot of opportunities, because companies are definitely wanting to do this, and they're out there and they're looking for folks to build these tests and manage the testing process. So let's test. I'm going to go ahead and show you GhostInspector, and we'll create a test and we'll modify it, and I'll show you some of the things that GhostInspector can do. I want to point out, as I'm going through this demo, I'll try to point out just some details about automated testing in general that are going to be helpful for you, whether you're using GhostInspector or whether you've decided to code your own tests or you're using other tools or packages that are out there, and just touch on some general concepts to think about if you're creating these types of tests for your application. So this is our website. I'll just pop in to the app here. We've got a dashboard, and you can have suites and folders and organize your tests to see, what's passing and what's failing. I've set up this demo suite, which is just a grouping that doesn't have any tests yet. And we're going to record a test and drop it into this demo suite. So to do that, I'm going to pop over to this, just this really simple form we'll start off on. And we can imagine that this is maybe like a contact form in our app or a sign up form or any type of form on our website that we want to test. Up in the corner of my browser here, I've got this ghost icon, and that's the GhostInspector browser extension. This is a free extension that we have available in Chrome and Firefox. You install it, and the first time you open it, it'll have you log into your account. And at that point, it'll be connected to your GhostInspector account. So any tests you record, anything you create will just be synced to your GhostInspector account. And then you can use our service to run it in the cloud. So we're going to go ahead and create a new test here. I can also modify tests using this extension, but we'll just create a new one. Let's start recording. And when I do that, the extension is going to turn green. So that means it's capturing what I'm doing now. So we'll come down and start to fill out this contact form with some data. Give it a name. Give it an email address. We'll say, am I a customer? Yes. Add some comments. I'll submit the form, and I get this success message. So really important detail here that goes for all testing, and especially this type of codeless browser testing. After I perform my action, so I've been recording those operations, I want to make an assertion. So the idea with an assertion is I want to make sure that I didn't just fill out this form and hit submit. I want to make sure that that submission actually went through. So what I can do with GhostInspector is I come up and I can switch over to this make assertions mode. And when I do that, I get this crosshair that starts to highlight things on the page. And the idea is that I can click on something here and I can assert a certain element or a certain text to make sure it's present as an indicator to know that, like, okay, this form submission actually worked. So for instance, I can click this successfully submitted message. That's a good one. And it highlights it in green and records an assertion. Assertions exist like in all tests. So even going back to simple unit tests, the same concept applies. If you've got a unit test that adds two numbers and you pass in 1 and you pass in 2, you don't just call the function and say, okay, I passed in the numbers, I'm done. You'd want to get the result and make sure that 1 + 2 = 3. So this is the equivalent of that. You're making sure that those actions you carried out actually landed you where you want. And that's the best way to truly confirm that you're not just submitting the form and hoping it works. You're actually confirming that it works. I'll come back up to the extension. I can switch back over and record more actions and do other things, but we'll just say I'm finished recording. We'll give this test a name and call it sample form. We'll throw it in that demo suite. We do a screenshot comparison, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we're going to execute an initial test run here. So I'll save this test. And what's happened is that Ghost Inspector has taken those actions, that assertion, it's turned it into a test, it's saved it to my Ghost Inspector account, and now I get this link to the test. And if I click that, I can see now there's one in progress run. My test has been triggered using Chrome, a default screen size and geolocation, and my test is running. So Ghost Inspector now launched a browser, it walked through those same exact steps, did the assertion, took screenshots and video, and here it's come back and given me a result. So I'll walk through some of the different things you get here, and then we'll talk a little more about those selectors that we were discussing earlier. So I've got my latest completed result. I get some data up here about when it ran, the browser and screen size, location. It took 20 seconds to run. When I come down here, the first thing I'm going to look at is my steps. So you can see I opened this demo URL, and here you can see the steps being carried out. So I clicked on the first name field, I assigned Justin, I clicked on the last name field, so on and so forth. Here's an input where the name equals email. So this is the email input. And you'll notice that this selector in particular looks a lot like the one that we were experimenting with in Google, right? So the recorder is creating these selectors for you. In some cases, it's creating multiple like backup selectors in case they change. And it's saving them in the test so that it knows these are the elements I'm interacting with as I'm going through. So we can see my steps here. I'm submitting the form. In this case, this selector had opted to use Xpath and match that button based on the text of the button. And then here, finally, I have my assertion where I'm looking for that text that tells me the form has been successfully submitted, right? Below that, I even get console output. So these would be things that come up in the console, messages, output, JavaScript errors. This one we output on purpose so we can see it. This is a JavaScript error. It's highlighted in red. I can even have my test fail, if I wanted it to fail when this comes up. You can use variables. I'll talk about that a little bit later, commenting. On the right side here, what we get for the test run is a full video. So this is the test as it's being executed on the Ghost Inspector servers. And you can see we highlight the element as it's going through and interacting. So you can get a really good idea of what's going on with your test here. You can watch the full video of it. Below that too, I also get a screenshot. So I get an automatic screenshot at the end of my test. I can add them throughout later on if I'd like. But I get this one when the test finished that's also showing this successful message. And you can see this has got a passing status as well. So my steps up here are passing. My screenshot is also passing, and it says this is a new baseline screenshot. So this was the first test run, and the test is saying, okay, I know that this is what the screen is supposed to look like now. This is now my baseline for what the screen looks like. And I'll show you, we'll actually break this test in a minute just so we can see what a failure looks like. But Ghost Inspector, anytime it runs now, it's going to look for this screenshot. And if something looks different, it's going to tell me. Down at the bottom here, you get an ongoing test run history. So you can always pop back into old results and view them. And of course, at this point, anytime I want to run this test, I can click the run button and Ghost Inspector will fire up another browser. I have API access. I can do scheduling and things like that. But really quickly, we can go from no testing to testing the full functionality of a form in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to pop into these steps and we'll talk a little bit about some of the actions and selectors that are happening here. So I have the ability to codelessly edit this test. You can see it gives me steps, the clicking, the assigning. I can come in here and modify these. So all the various types of functions a human would carry in a browser, mousing over things, dragging and dropping, screenshots, JavaScript, different types of assertions. I can even do things up here where, and this is a good practice. Again, this is one of those things like whether you're using Ghost Inspector or just in general, I can actually start to break out reusable segments of my test. So maybe at the beginning of this test, I can pretend that I actually needed to log in. I can have my login steps saved in Ghost Inspector, and I can just import those at the beginning of my test when I need them. So I can take these actions that are going to be repeated in my website or application and make a reusable module out of them, and then just import them wherever I'd like. So that, from a maintenance perspective, that's really nice and something I recommend even if you opt to code your tests thinking about putting repeated things in functions, or looking at something like the page object model and some of the approaches used if you're coding these out. We also have conditionals. So you can use JavaScript to look at certain things on the page. Maybe you're doing A/B testing and there are different variations of the page. So, you could look for something. Let's do a quick query here. I could say, find all the widgets on the page, and if there's more than one, run this step. And if there's not, skip the step. And I can do this with whole sequences. I can get as elaborate as I want here. We support, completely async JavaScript steps. So if you want to go out, like actually make API calls and do something based on a certain result, if you want to drop jQuery onto the page, you can do that kind of stuff. And you can do it in conditionals. You can do it in your JavaScript steps. So lots and lots of flexibility. And I also mentioned variables. So you can pull data off of the page and use it somewhere else, or pass data into your test. So you might say, okay, this test is placing an order, and then I want to get that order ID. So I could do something like, I've got this order ID element, and I'm going to throw that into a variable, and then I'm going to take that variable and assign it later on in the step. Or I could have a generic first name variable here, and I could either plug in something random. We provide a bunch of random variables. You could do data-driven testing where you're actually passing in a spreadsheet full of different first names, and you're triggering this test, 50 times with all different sets of data. So there's a huge amount of flexibility here. And for the most part, anything you would do as a user on your app or website, you can replicate it here with a test. Just drop those changes. So I want to show you what this actually looks like when a test fails, and we'll take a look at the screenshot comparison too. So let's pretend that, let's see, maybe when we click yes for being custom, we'll just break that selector for the moment, right? And we'll save the test, and then we'll run this. So what's going to happen is GhostInspector is going to launch the test, run through the steps, and it's not going to be able to find that that input element, and eventually it's going to fail. Now, we're intending to do this. If you're, obviously you want to make your tests as durable as possible, so we have the option to specify backup selectors and lots of logic built into GhostInspector that's going to help mitigate some of the normal issues that come up for you, so that ideally you're dealing with a lot fewer failures than you would if you were coding these out. But in this case, we actually want this test to fail just so we can take a look at the screenshot comparison. It's going to take a little bit longer because GhostInspector is going to be looking at that step and spending a little extra time looking to see if it can find that element for us. So here we are, it's come back, and you can see the steps are failing here. And if we jump down to step number 7, this element isn't found, right? I've purposely botched the selector. So I can get, obviously email notifications, or I can fail my CI pipeline when things like this happen. Over here on the right side, though, you can see our screenshot comparison kicked in as well. So I can use this compare button and do a side-by-side view. So in the middle here is the baseline. This is what it looked like when we were successful, and GhostInspector knows that. And here's what it sees now. It couldn't find this customer input down here. And these pages are different. So it did a diff here, and you can see, if I kind of zoom in here, it grays out the areas that are the same, and it highlights the ones that are different. So you can see that it didn't get that success message. It still has the form here. Looks like the header moved up. And so it's, showing all that diff here. And this is really, really handy. And this is another area that's like really growing like crazy in the industry. Lots of tools out there around visual testing. And it's super nice because in this case, this is a little bit of a contrived scenario because I know my test failed, but this can be really handy, especially if your steps pass. So if your app worked the way you'd expect it to work, but a screen doesn't look the way it's supposed to look, you'd want to know. And this can alert you and say, hey, your steps passed and your app is working, but something isn't looking the way it's supposed to look. If my steps pass and the screenshot changes and it's an expected change, for instance, maybe I changed the way my application looks, I can actually accept this new screenshot. So I can tell GhostInspector, it's okay, this is now what the screenshot's supposed to look like. We changed our logo or changed the UI, and I can say, this is the new baseline now. And GhostInspector will actually maintain baselines for different browsers, different screen sizes, including mobile and tablet, different geolocations. So really nice extra layer of security on top of your functional tests. We'll go back in and just fix this step real quick and run it so we can have our test passing again. But having both of those layers is a really nice addition to testing. I'm going to pop in and just go through some of the settings here. Obviously things like details and status badges are available for your repos. Scheduling is an option that we can offer because we're hosted, and that's kind of nice. When I was talking about 10 or 15 core features of your website or app that you want working, it can be handy to actually monitor your live website and make sure they're working. And actually, a lot of our customers do this. You'd be surprised how many things don't happen in your staging environment, but do happen in production because you're going from a handful of engineers testing the app to thousands of users using it, right? So maybe that crushes your database, or maybe something went wrong on deployment, or maybe there's a server issue that's kind of outside the realm of what you're working on, but affects the site. So you can have these tests running every hour or at certain minutes of the day, in addition to running them post deployment or during your testing process. Other things to think about when you're doing this type of testing: does your site have multiple languages? Do you want to test in multiple languages? HTTP authentication for staging sites and things like that. I'm going to come back to step timing because that's a general topic that I want to talk about more. Display sizes. So I mentioned there's a lot of cool products out there. Applitools is kind of one of the original ones doing visual testing, but we give you lots of different screen sizes. So if you have a responsive site, again, this is browser-based, so this isn't like native apps. But if you have a responsive website, you can hit it with iPhone screen sizes and iPad screen sizes and so on. Lots of features around screenshot comparison. And again, whether you're doing screenshot comparison with GhostInspector or your own kind of thing, there's lots of things to think about. How sensitive should it be? Am I willing to accept a little bit of change, or do I want to be really picky and know if it changes at all? Are there elements on the page that are dynamic? Maybe your test places an order and displays the order ID, and that ID increments every time. So you record your test and it's 123, and then it's 124 and 125, and that's changing the screen. So maybe you want to hide those elements, or maybe you've got dynamic ads. So this goes back to selectors. You can use CSS selectors and Xpath selectors to target elements, again, in this same way, and actually pull those out of your screenshot before it gets taken. And that can be really helpful for hiding certain things, or even just taking the screenshot of a certain area of your app. Geolocation's another thing to think about. Are you running your tests from various places around the world? Maybe the folks in London see a different version of your site than the folks in Singapore do, or things along those lines. So again, this is a nice perk of being a hosted service. We can run these at different locations for you. Data sources, I mentioned this idea of what's called data-driven testing, which again is something that lots of companies do and are looking for people who understand this concept of uploading a spreadsheet with 100 different sets of data, all different first names, last names, and sending that through their contact form or their sign-up form. And did the bogus email get accepted or did it fail? So with GhostInspector, you can upload CSV spreadsheets and you can run your tests with that data every time you run it. I'll skip a couple of these, but notifications, of course, things like email, webhooks, Slack, and so on. I'm going to come back to step timing just because this is a really important concept to understand when you're doing automated testing in general. There are things that as a human, we kind of know to wait for in the browser. We're instinctively know that, if you've ever been on a site and you add an item to the shopping cart, and then you get a spinner for 2 or 3 seconds, right? And then up in the corner, that number 1 appears next to the cart. You know, like, okay, my item's in the cart. Now I'm going to click checkout. Well, automated systems don't always know that. With GhostInspector, we've tried to build a lot of logic in to manage that for you. So it'll like automatically search for elements. It'll wait for them to appear. It'll wait for them to be visible. It'll wait for them to be enabled. It'll look at network requests. It'll try to get an idea of like, do I need to wait a little bit longer or retry an action? But these are things you need to think about. And especially if you're coding tests, you really need to think about these. You know, I'm looking for that checkout icon that appears after I add an item. How long should I wait until it appears? You know, should I keep checking for 15 seconds before I give up, or 30 seconds before I give up? A lot of coding libraries out there don't do this for you. They just won't wait at all. So they click add to cart. They look for the checkout button like 100 milliseconds later. And if it's not there, it's going to fail. So something to really keep in mind as you're building tests. Timing is a huge factor, and you really have to think about those little interactions where timing occurs, and use some of the tools available to you, whether it's these settings or using assertions are also really handy. You know, clicking the add to cart button and then asserting that checkout button is visible and then moving on. Things like that can really help the flow of your test and cut down in those like false failures and flakiness. We'll pop back out here to our test. So it passed again after we fixed that step. I'll pop out another level here to our demo suite, and this is where we started. So now we've got this sample form test in here, and I can start building more tests. I can use the recorder. I could come in here and actually like create new tests from scratch. So, you know, if I want to start a test on Google, I can create it and I can go in here and just start adding my steps codelessly. So this is a little more akin to like the traditional way of building your tests out by adding the steps yourself. But some folks have a really good handle on it and they want to do this, and they'll add backup selectors and leverage all these tools. A couple more things I'll touch on really quickly that are GhostInspector features and things to think about. As I start to build out a suite, you know, maybe I get to the point where I've got 30, 40, 50, 100 tests, and that can really slow things down, right? I want to test as quickly as I can. So what's nice about GhostInspector is you run your tests in parallel. So when you click this run entire suite button, we're going to launch all those tests as quickly as we can alongside each other, and we're going to rip through them. And that's great. And it's really a goal to strive for, again, whether you're using us or building these tests, because nobody wants to push their changes to GitHub and make the pull request, and then you're waiting like 2 hours, you know, for that checkbox because, you know, one by one, these tests are being launched in a VM somewhere. So parallel testing is kind of another trend that's gotten more popular as more places start to support it. It's an approach we've always taken, and we think it's helpful. It's helpful to think about your tests in an independent way anyway, so that they all pass or fail independently and you're not worrying about them going one by one. Now, there might be situations where you want to do that. You know, for us, that means you come in and you enable this concurrency limitation. You say, actually, I only want to run one test. Or in some cases, you might say, I only want to run 5 because my staging server is wildly underpowered and I don't want to crush it. So you do have that option. You can pass data from one test to the next test. So one test might sign up, and then the next test might create an order, and then the next test might process that order. And it's all happening sequentially, and you're dealing with state that's being passed and moved around. So, you know, that's a possibility. And there's some situations where it's necessary. But I definitely recommend thinking about your testing from the parallel standpoint and trying to design it in a way where you can really rip through these tests and get results as quickly as possible, because that's beneficial to the team, and it lets you push out your changes faster and know that they're working. I'll just pop back out here to the dashboard. So again, here it's kind of where we started. We've got our demo suite. Now we've got our 2 tests in there. We didn't run that second one I created. So we've got one passing its steps and then one passing its screenshot. So that's kind of GhostInspector in a nutshell, and that's how we do automated codeless testing. There's a whole bunch of features that I didn't touch on that we have, and other information as well. One thing I'll throw in the chat that I specifically want to point out is some information on our blog, especially around CSS selectors and XPath selectors, because that's kind of the fundamental core of at least knowing what's happening with your codeless test under the hood, or any browser test. And I'll throw this in the chat. This is a really great blog post that kind of goes from the very beginning of like a better explanation that I gave during this presentation of, what are selectors, what are elements, how does this targeting work? And this can give you a really good base level understanding of those selectors and help you, manage and build your tests.
All right.
Yeah, I'm gonna open up for questions and any other conversation now.
Okay. Yeah. So if anybody has any questions about codeless testing or testing in general, definitely feel free to pop them in the chat here, and Justin will answer them.
I'll throw this in the chat as well.
So yeah, just to talk a little bit about while we wait possibly for some questions, but NAC has we've kind of gone through all kinds of iterations of various apps, but as it stands right now, we have a job board built in Next.js, and we also have a sort of a recruiter app built. It's actually the job board is Next.js, and we have the mobile companion for that built in React Native, and then we also have a recruiter app built in React, and the mobile companion built in React Native. And we use GhostInspector for both of those. And Oz is the engineer with NAC. That he's kind of our GhostInspector guru, and he loves it. He's probably watching right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, no, he's done everything. He's done he'll send out email confirmations and then basically click the button and make sure. Just all kinds of crazy stuff. I haven't even actually dug that deep into GhostInspector, but sometimes I'll tell him, can we test like a file upload, or can we test an email confirmation? Can we test this? And he's also created like these little reusable sort of pieces in there where, you do the login piece and then you can kind of import that into your other tests, so you don't have to, constantly redo that stuff. And the thing is just crazy, man.
That's awesome. I'm sure we've talked to him in support. It's always fun to have like customers and users reach out and be like, okay, I want to test this. I have this crazy idea to test this thing. Can I do it? And trying to think of ways to facilitate that is always.
So did you code most of that thing yourself or what?
I definitely can't say that anymore. I launched this, in 2014, and for a while it was very solo. But for the past several years, I've had a team of awesome folks, engineers, designers, sales and support. So I don't think the majority of the code is mine anymore. But
I see you did a nice reskinning website and everything. Looks really nice.
Yeah, we just did a relaunch. I was happy to present the new design. We've got an awesome designer who also, by the way, these slides would have looked so much worse if I didn't have her. But yeah, we did a relaunch, new logo, and really, really happy with the way things are looking. I feel like it's a lot more intuitive. Yeah,
well, it looks really good. Well, I appreciate your time here. That was the last talk of the day, so I'll let you go, and I will just kind of wrap up here. But I really do appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'll just throw out, we are a paid product, but we do have both a trial, and if you're a student, please just ping us. We have a free forever tier. We can put you on. You can tinker with our tool to learn the ins and outs, and at some point it may be helpful for you, or at least get you that fundamental knowledge. So don't hesitate to shoot us an email or ping us on Intercom.
And Justin is a new daddy, and he has a new beautiful daughter there.
Yeah, fortunately, there weren't any background shrieks for this.
I've had mine kind of, off the whole time. I've got a 4-year-old, so she's pretty wild. Okay, well, I will let you go, and I do appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Take care, Leroy. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye. All righty, well, that wraps things up for the day. There'll be a 1-hour break, or I guess a little over 1 hour. And we did set up, so when I say networking, you look over on the left-hand side there, and you have the networking button, and then you also have the sessions button. And the networking button is just kind of like this, again, like I said, this almost like speed dating kind of stuff where you can click the button and you just randomly get paired off with somebody for 3 minutes, and y'all can talk for a second, and then after 3 minutes, it'll pair you off with someone else just to kind of randomly meet people. Otherwise, if you just want to sit around kind of in a multi sort of screen fashion and kind of socialize a little bit, there's some networking sessions in that sessions area. And whenever the boot camps open up, they will also appear. The boot camps are scheduled. The networking sessions are not. And so the networking sessions are just always in there in that sessions area. But the boot camps will pop up at 6 o'clock. And Heather's been working all day to get everybody added to the proper boot camps. And so you should have already heard from her. But thank you all for watching today. And I'm hoping you're learning some cool stuff. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on decentralization and blockchain. And so there'll be a lot of really prominent teams talking about that. And also we'll have a panel discussion about crypto investing and teach you guys a little bit about that. And it's going to be a cool day tomorrow. But signing off.